Welcome to the podcast, Kelly Snider. How are you doing today?
I am great. I'm super excited to chat with you.
I am too. I'm going to tell the listeners a little bit about you before we start our conversation. So, Kelly Snider has been a storyteller, a dreamer, and connector of people for over 20 years. She is a best-selling author and story strategist who thoughtfully collects and preserves stories through creating events, writing books, interviewing guests on her podcast, and facilitating life-changing story workshops. She's an expert at extracting stories and identifying value and strength within the narrative. As an acclaimed event producer, she highlights her clients' individual stories, needs, and goals. Since the 1990s, Kelly's story-focused events have raised over $12 million for charities around the world. Kelly brings her mission of supporting and inspiring others to life through sharing the stories that connect us all. Through her platforms, the Power of Story Conference 2017, Epic Exchanges podcast, and the Epic Exchanges collaborative book series, she helps people find the true gifts within their stories in order to share, inspire, and transform lives. Kelly thrives in finding ways to connect people, whether it is charity, food and wine, or simply an engaged conversation. She is able to see the possibilities that are often overlooked in both in business and personal interactions. Kelly's generosity and sharing her stories of overcoming has emboldened thousands to find the freedom and strength to share their own. Welcome, Kelly.
Wow. Thank you. I'm like listening. I'm like, oh, it keeps going. This is great. Making me feel really good.
Oh, well, it's all about you. It's all about your life and so much that you have given to others, especially through stories. And I'm so interested because I just love to hear people's stories, but you connect people with their stories. And you have published two books. One is The Gift in Your Story. Was a collaborative effort. And the newest one, Your Story, Your Strength. Can you tell and share a little bit about each one of those?
Yeah. So the gift in your story was a bit of a pandemic project. I've always known how important our stories are. And whether we have a corporation or we're an individual or we have a solo business enterprise, our stories help us connect with other people. They help us realize that we are more the same than we are different. And so I was super lucky to connect with 11 women who trusted me to take them through a process of finding their stories, doing some healing work, because they're
Mm,
not, stories aren't inspiring or encouraging or motivating or any of the positive things if they're not healed. We
yes.
pass on the pain. And I learned that because of my story. and then so once we did some healing work, then it was about sharing their story in a way that um, did inspire people and really brought out the gift in whatever their experience was, the good things, the blessings that
Mhm.
none of us would have without going through the challenges.
Correct.
And
Correct.
then my book, Your Story, Your Strength, and it's hard to
Yes.
see there, but
Yes. Thank you.
there it is it takes my story, which starts when I was 3 years old, and there was a fire that took the lives of my parents that I and my sister were rescued from, and the ensuing problems that developed, the ensuing things that happened in my life because of that big trauma and tragedy.
Mhm.
Uh, and it weaves it in between the importance of finding our stories, all of our stories. They don't have to be just challenging, overcoming stories. They're the positive stories, the achievements as well, and how important it is to collect them all, to make sure they're healed, and all the
Yeah.
things that kind of come into that healing process, and then finding the way that's right for us to share them to inspire others. Because our story, the things that we've learned, the ways we've grown,
Mhm.
is really our legacy at the end of the day.
Yeah.
I think it's Maya Angelou, who's, I might be wrong about that, but who says that people don't remember, and I'm totally paraphrasing, don't remember what we did,
Mhm.
they remember how we made them feel.
Yes.
And that's where our stories come in.
Oh, there's so much there. I'm just like, there's so much. I want to you talked about a lot of times I think, stories always have this, oh, a tragic moment, where our lives are transformed. And I don't know, I don't feel like I have that in my story background. So how do you help people, that might not feel like they have any, big tragedy in their life, to know that their stories matter? Because you said something about positive aspects too and accomplishments. So how do you help people kind of, well, I don't have a tragedy, so I don't really have a story.
Yeah. So a couple things there. One is that when we live our stories every day, our experience every day, we tend to normalize it. So it becomes kind of boring. A lot of the responses I get from people is, "Oh, my story's too boring," because we compare our stories to ones that we've read, ones that inspire us. And we often find ours lacking because the more we go through it every day, the more it just becomes part of our life and it doesn't seem so extraordinary anymore. So to give you an example, and this always hits people really hard,
Okay.
but just as a little caveat, uh, almost 18 years ago, my sister-in-law had a major stroke and she was left locked in, which means that she is totally paralyzed, but fully cognitive. And she can only move her eyes up for yes and down for no. So
Mm.
she can answer yes or no questions, fully cognitive. When she had her stroke, her kids were 9 and 5, and I was really close with them and stuff. But all of that to say that the more we lived in the reality of her stroke and her new situation and taking care of like our family, just kind of like closing in and taking care of everyone, the more it was just like you just get through each day and it becomes normal and it doesn't become as impactful. But someone else hearing it for the first time would be, oh my gosh, like, what did you do? How did you manage? How did her kids manage? How are they, like, all those questions
Right.
where it seems, because it's a tragedy and
Mhm.
it's traumatic, but we learn to live our lives. So that's what I mean when I say normalize. So we kind of forget the impact of our stories, number one.
Mhm.
But number two is, yes, it's positive stories as well as the challenging ones. And the fact that I said positive, I don't love that because I don't like terming them positive or negative. They
Right,
just are
right.
what they are. But I help people find all of those I run a free masterclass called Start Your Story Collection that is really about having people start to find the hundreds, if not thousands of stories that we all have that can impact people, because we forget a lot of them, but we also don't think of a lot of them as stories, and they can be anything from whatever someone else thinks is cool about us. That or a bucket list item that someone's like, "Oh, I've always wanted to do that." Like whenever I tell people that my years long dream of doing a hot air balloon ride I did in Sedona over all the cool rock formations and everything, people
Cool.
are like, "Oh, I've always wanted to do that." I'm like, that's actually a cool story that inspires people to then do something on their bucket
Mhm.
list.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it doesn't have to be these big drama, like overwhelming things.
Mhm. Yeah, that really hits home as far as like, we live our lives and it's just normal to us, right?
Yeah.
Like what we do every day, is just, we live it. It's day in, day out, like no big deal. But it's interesting to have somebody else, say what they are inspired, about you,
Mm-hmm.
and to give a different perspective. It's like kind of those exercises where, in kids in school, at least my kids, at least in school, come home and like they have a sheet of paper and everybody has to put down what they like about that person, and it's like, oh, it's kind of eye-opening. So you're just saying any of those things could be great stories.
Yeah, because it all comes down to, what have we learned from that experience?
Mm.
Or what are we proud of in that experience? What do we have now in our lives that we wouldn't have had without that experience?
Mhm.
Whether it's challenging, whether it's an achievement, whether it's just something cool and fun.
Yeah, so I'm just thinking all my kids' achievements, got 6 kids and, 4 of them have been in college and also have done college sports. And it's just like, that just seems normal in our house. but it's not normal. Not, not
Yeah.
everybody has that. And so working up towards that, what choices, what did they learn, through that process. So it's just a learning.
Yeah,
It's a story about something you've learned.
exactly.
And so we all have those. I sure hope we learn something every day.
Well, and if we think about what it is that inspires us in someone else or in their story, like when I think back to the first story that I kind of like caught on to
Mhm.
and realized, oh, like this excites me. It inspires me. It's actually a Canadian Olympian rower who was in a major accident 6 weeks before the Olympics. She was a world champion, like had won all the world's races, and she was expected to win gold. She was training. Another country's boat went into her, ripped her leg open, and they didn't think she'd ever walk again. And her story, basically 6 weeks later, she ended up competing in the Olympics and winning bronze. She didn't win gold, but that was beside the point. I was in tears,
Yeah.
because I'm Canadian and she's Canadian, and we as the country followed every moment.
Mhm.
But it's such a story of overcoming and triumph. And here she'd won a medal on the world stage. And not only that, they didn't think she'd walk again. She
Yeah.
spent 6 weeks in the hospital doing whatever she could to keep up her strength, to keep up her training, to train her muscles so that she could get back in the rowing skill. Like, and that to me, I still get chills.
Yes. Yes. But it's those stories, overcoming. Have we overcome something in our own lives? That's a story for us,
Yeah.
right? And you talked about leaving it's kind of a legacy. It's sometimes those stories from the past, like who's
Mm,
going to know about them unless we tell them?
yeah.
And how many of our, I'm just thinking my dad passed away a year ago, all those stories that are
That are
now
gone.
gone.
Yeah, and it's funny because I talk about that in my book, and also it's a new area that I'm exploring to help people
Mhm.
with, because I've had a lot of feedback about that. Is when I was in my 20s, I had this idea because my grandparents had such cool stories about the being living where I grew up,
Mhm.
and the formation of the town suburb of Vancouver and everything.
Mhm.
And I had this idea that I wanted to record them to capture the stories. And then I thought, I'm in my early 20s. They're going to think it's stupid. I'm wasting my time. I'm going to get all this negativity. And I never did it. And now, with my grandparents and my parents all gone, my adoptive family, as well as my birth family, I've lost that opportunity. And I think a lot of people that I'm talking to are feeling like that opportunity is slipping away from them as well. So
Mhm.
how do we start capturing those stories of our ancestors, because they inform who we are?
Yeah.
And whether we believe it and know it or not, the more
Mhm.
we know about their stories and whatever they've been through, what they've learned, the more actual insight we have into ourselves.
Mhm.
And we actually can have healing from that as well.
Yeah, and I want to touch, wrap back around with that healing process because I feel like, I've experienced on that, looking back on a situation or an experience, and I can learn new things from it. And you talked about with the gift of your story, the 11 women that you worked with, and they had to go through the healing process first. So how can, stories heal us, but also, transform? So maybe more so on the healing process.
Right. So when I first started writing my story, the first version of this book
Mhm.
was about 80 typewritten pages, like 16 years ago. So it's been a long
Yeah.
process. And I had three people read it. I had my sister read it, and she was like, "Hey, it's your story." And then I had a friend read it who's like, "Oh, you got to keep writing. I want to know what happens next." And then I had one other friend read it who has her doctorate in counseling and everything. And her response was, "All I feel is the pain."
Mm.
And I realized that it wasn't there yet.
Mm.
And so the healing process is multi-layered, and it's different for everyone. And it can include counseling and therapy. It can include having the conversations where we gain deeper understanding. It's a lot of dedicated work on ourselves, journaling, really diving into why we do the things we do, why we think the things we think, and where our hurts and insecurities are that maybe need more attention. And I do, in the work that I do with my groups, I have a group called the Sacred Story Circle. That's a small group program for 8 to 12 weeks, depending on the group.
Yeah.
And we spend a third of that time on healing stuff, and it's diving into the emotion and how do we want to change that emotion, and are we looking at things objectively? Are we seeing things? This is a great quote that just kind of came back to me this week. Anais Nin says, "We do not see things as they are. We see them as we are."
Mhm.
And we need to be able to take a step back from our stories, and quite honestly, the stories we tell ourselves about them.
Oh,
So
yes.
if we haven't had an interaction 10 years ago and my feelings were hurt, you know, was that actually something that you did or said, or is it something in me? But until I know your story, I can never break that down.
Mhm.
I had that realization recently where I was a teenager working at a summer camp, and I was working in the kitchen, and there was this other young girl at the time, same age as me, same stage in life, first time there in the kitchen. I thought she was so cool. And I just wanted to be her friend. And I was trying to like get into whatever it looked like. And I'd never felt connected to her. And just recently, we had this major reunion of anybody that worked at this camp back in that decade. It's a long time ago now. And she actually got up to share a piece of her story at one point at a mealtime. And she talked about how insecure she was and how weird and different she felt and how uncomfortable she was, and how some people called her out and said, "Hey, stop hiding behind your hair." She had the best hair. And, and how people saw her. And I realized in that moment that the way I was feeling back in my late teens, early 20s wasn't about me not being cool enough to be her friend or whatever. It was totally about her and how she saw herself and her insecurities. And so it's not until we engage with people that we can learn those things about ourselves. And then it frees us.
Yeah, I've been reading a little bit about your new story, your book, your story, the strength in your story, and how you went and looked back through newspaper articles and found, and then, the town exploded as far as like memories of all of that. And I think it's so interesting to take other people's perspectives of the same situation, and you can piece together other things, just like you told about in, the camp, story with the other girl. It's just like, sometimes it's not us.
Yeah.
It's somebody else's story that
Totally.
we're interjecting ourselves into that story, but we're making it about us, and it's not really about us.
Yeah. And it's the filter we put on it. And another example I use in my book is that 100 of us could experience the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And we all have a different story about it because we have a different filter. We're coming at it with a background of different experiences and relationships and knowledge and all kinds of things. A perfect example of that, a very tragic, sad example, is 9/11.
Oh yeah.
Because the thousands of people who escaped the World Trade Center towers,
Mm-hmm.
and millions, if not billions, of people who watched it
Mm-hmm.
on TV or watched replays or
Right.
watched it unfold. And everybody has a different story
Mm-hmm.
because everything was slightly different.
Yes.
It's like a director on a film choosing which angle to have the camera from, or
Yeah.
through which character's eyes. It changes what's going on. And the more we can look into all the other eyes, different angles, different filters, the more we understand, and the more we're able to move ahead and realize that, well, really to heal the hurt places.
Yeah, because I see it as the more perspectives, then you can open up the perspectives within yourself to be able to heal and understand how that affected you. And maybe some of the experiences you had in the past that, kind of latched onto that, whether it was hurt or, what you experienced. I mean, I remember being pregnant during that time. and just being concerned about what the world's going to be like for my, kid that's going to be born in a few months.
Yeah.
It's, but not everybody was in that same experience as I had. There were, all sorts of different things, but it's that, how do you tell the story of your story and the
Yeah.
experiences you've had?
Well, and really the key to that, to keep it as simple as possible, is to make sure that you're telling your story. Don't tell anybody else's. It's not wise of us to assume or to ascribe any thoughts or feelings to anybody else, because unless we were in their head and in their life, it's probably going to be wrong because of our filter. So all we can talk about is facts of what happened and our own thoughts and feelings.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's super key in when we go to share our stories, to make sure that we are sharing our story. When I'm sharing my story, I'm not talking about my mother or my father or what they did or said or whatever, unless it's factual somewhere and can be looked up.
Right, right, right.
So
But that also brings out the gift that we have in each of our own stories, because that makes every one of us unique, and we have our own story because it's from our perspective, from our
exactly.
experiences.
Yeah.
So
And
we
so,
all
yeah, we might feel that, oh, my story is so much like theirs
Mhm.
or similar. Well, it's not,
Yeah.
because you are different from that person. So the story becomes unique and there's a different take on it. There's a different takeaway. And
Mhm.
so something else that can inspire someone else. And quite honestly, anybody who's listening or reading or whatever our stories, they bring their own set of filters. So they're going to get what they need out of it in that moment.
Yeah. And your story could be the one that inspires them to do something that they haven't done before, or, like hot air balloon.
Exactly.
That just might be. And because it's in your voice, your own unique voice, it might touch them in a certain way that actually, moves them forward. And because sometimes
Yeah,
we read things honestly and it doesn't touch us, right? It doesn't
exactly.
hit us. And sometimes we can read it years later and then it touches us. So it's really interesting about our place in our own stories and somebody else's stories.
Yeah. And it gets exciting when you see how our stories intermingle and how we might have inspired someone and then they say, oh, but you've inspired me. And like that part is so exciting. So yeah, love it.
The ripple effect of that.
Exactly.
So you mentioned, too, it's not just our personal stories, but, you have a business, I have a business. A lot of people have are in business of their own or work for a business. How is this related to stories for businesses? And how often they're pretty much overlooked, aren't they? I mean, I think.
Well, I mean, I don't know if they're overlooked because there's a lot out there right now that like the whole marketing world has
Okay.
changed in
Yep.
terms of the importance of story. And
Mhm.
quite honestly, and maybe it's my filter because I'm in the story world that I see a lot of stuff around story. But stories connect us. They touch our emotions. And so when it comes to the business world, um, we want to share stories that get people excited, that get their imaginations going, that get them curious. And we see that in advertising on television shows. And if people are streaming and not getting ads anymore, then you're seeing less of it, but it's still out there. It's still
Yeah.
on our social
Yep.
media feeds, all of those things. And the ones that grab our attention and make us want to know more or make us want to interact, generally in some way share a story
Mhm.
that is often aspirational. So, meaning that it's something that we want to see in our lives, or that ways we want to grow. Someone in business who is telling their story, but maybe they're doing it from a beach in the Caribbean, or they're, from out in front of their car. I mean, there's a lot of it that's
Right.
very staged, right? But it conveys this message in a lot of ways, that if I follow what you're telling me to do, or if I do the steps you
Mhm.
did or
Yep.
whatever, because you're telling me that story, then I will have these things in my life as well. And whether that's huge success, lots of money, lots of trips, being able to work from anywhere, all those
Yep.
things, it's aspirational. It's something, oh, I would love to have that.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so that's where the storytelling piece comes
Okay.
in. Now,
Okay.
what I'd like to see more of is people sharing more authentic, real, not filtered, not curated so much, even though I call myself a bit of a story curator, but that's for a lot of the organizations I've
Yeah.
worked with and the people that I work with in terms of finding those right stories.
Mhm.
There's a lot, social media with the advent of reels and
Yep.
stories and stuff. There's been a big trend to put a story out there that's impactful in 30 to 60 seconds. And sadly, I find a lot of those trends are a little bit of trauma dumping,
Mm.
because I liken it a little bit to a drive-by shooting. And I know that sounds horrible, but
Yeah.
it's someone driving through a community, just spraying an area and hoping that you hit your target, but there's a lot of unintended problems.
Yes. Yes.
Because we never know who we're triggering or whatever. And in 30 to 60 seconds, there's no way that we can give our full story and the healing and get it to a place where it's positive and inspirational and motivational,
Mhm.
because that's not enough time.
Yeah.
And also, we just don't know. When you're scrolling through reels or stories, you're scrolling, you have no idea what's going to come up next.
Yes.
There's no choosing of, oh,
Right.
I'd like to hear this person's story. So I think we need to be really careful, especially now, because there's so many filters. I mean, when we see people like doing, oh, here's, the glamour filter or whatever. I don't use
Oh yeah.
any,
Oh yeah.
but
My kids go
right?
through some of those just to be fun, and I'm like,
Totally. And so you start to question how much of this is real in anything that's out there. So the more truthful and authentic and vulnerable that we can be with our stories, and the good and the bad, the hard
yeah.
times, the struggles, all of that, the reality,
Mhm.
rather than just saying, hey, you want your next $100,000 month? Right? Like, it doesn't just happen like that. You don't just take a
Right.
course, boom, it's done.
Yes. Yes. And that brings up a really good point, because sometimes my brain doesn't like, oh, it's business, these are stories, but the marketing piece are just actually stories. And the stories normally evoke some emotion in us. So really all that marketing, all those the ads and things, you use something that you want to aspire to, it brings out that emotion, something you're yearning for or whatever. But then also those short ones are really emotion triggering, but like you said, they don't have the full story.
Yeah.
So you don't go, you get the rise of emotion, that initial impact, but then you don't get to ride it out. You don't get to see the healing process or the lesson or the learning from it. And
Yeah.
so it can, I don't know, to me that would kind of mess us up a little bit, right? Because it's stress triggering.
Totally. And I think that as a society, we don't even realize how stressed out we are most of the time by a lot of what we're getting on social media and what we're bombarded with, because we don't unplug enough.
Right.
How
Right.
often do we actually sit down and pick up a real book anymore?
Well, you know
Right?
what? These books are on my, bedside everywhere I go. And I'm like, oh, I'm going to read 20 minutes or 20 pages a day. And you know how often that does not happen? More often than I want to admit. But
Oh, me too.
I can spend 20 minutes scrolling.
Yeah. I can spend much longer than 20 minutes.
Oh,
And then
yes,
all of a
I
sudden
know.
being
I
like,
don't want to admit
how
that,
did so
but
much time go by?
yes. And so, but here where, because it takes that instant gratification of, learning things comes quicker and quicker and quicker. And in a book, we need to go through the process to totally understand the story in order to get the learning. We can't get
Yeah.
those, it's those headlines, make 100,000 in a year, in a month, it's like,
Yeah.
it's like we don't spend the time to learn that whole process and understand that it takes a while. And
Yeah.
oftentimes our stories takes years, right?
They do. And really the whole legacy piece of our stories, I actually share in at the end of my book when I'm talking about legacy, that something my grandfather went through, I don't want to get too involved, but something
Yeah.
that he went through with his children, it didn't have, well, not that it didn't. I think that a lot of people didn't see the full impact till 2 generations later,
Yeah.
when my brother, his wife had her stroke, and the thought for his children, and how he mentioned that the only way that he realized that he'd learned from my grandfather, and this is my birth grandfather and my step brother, because I was adopted into his family. So he wouldn't have had my grandfather had that not happened.
Mm.
But he learned from my grandfather's example.
Mm.
And so he had a choice to make when it came to how he was going to handle his wife's stroke, and how he was wanted to raise his boys, the example he wanted to set. And this was after my grandfather had passed away. And so I remember chatting about it with a group of friends, and one of them said, like, that's 2 generations.
Mhm.
And your grandfather might not know that that's the lasting legacy,
Yeah.
the lasting impact that he had, that needed to have all these other dominoes fall
Mm.
to be the example for my brother that it was.
Yeah. And that just kind of, I don't know where this came from, this quote came from, or where I've heard this, but you only really get to see 1% of the impact that you make.
Right.
And so that is just an example of like, we don't know what our actions and our stories and how it could impact somebody. And yet, we read history stories about people. Do we think that during that time they thought that was great too? Probably not. But we do
Exactly.
now. So that, generations later, it's like, oh, if that wouldn't have happened, like how life would have been different.
Yeah.
So the legacy is no matter what you go through your experiences, your legacy makes a difference. And I'm
Yeah.
so glad that you help, bring that out in people and share that.
Well, I think it's so important. And it's something as a society we've lost,
Mm.
because in previous generations, from earliest man, humankind, storytelling was practiced regularly. It's
Yeah.
how people passed on knowledge. It's how we have been able to accelerate civilization,
Mhm.
because someone figured out that a wheel works on a cart to help people move things faster. So it sped things up. But if they hadn't shared that and told that story, or the traveling
Mhm.
person visiting tribe to tribe wasn't sharing it, then that knowledge would have stayed right there. And then it'd have to be relearned every time.
Mhm.
And so our job is to share our experience, our story, our knowledge, so that the next generation can build upon that.
Yes. And so, so much. And we could talk
I
forever
know,
on
right?
this because I'm so
Totally.
passionate about the stories, and the impact they can make on others. And just realizing too, you know, yeah, just because I haven't lived through tragedies that I read about and are inspired about these hardships that I don't feel like I've been through. We all have stories to pass on what we've learned. And
Mhm.
because we live it, it's normal to us, it's just not normal to everybody
Yeah.
else.
Yeah.
So
And I can tell you, you have at minimum thousands of stories that can and do inspire and encourage
yeah.
people every day.
And it's not just me, it's everybody.
Exactly.
Every day that you live, you have at least one story, if not more.
Exactly.
I try to help my kids. They're like, "What did you learn today?" And I heard from another guest, I was like, "Well, maybe I should change the question to what did you mess up today? And
Hmm.
then what did you learn from that?"
I
Because
love that.
we often think it has to be something great and we want to downplay our mess ups, but our mess ups really make it faster to learn. So,
Exactly. Yeah, we learn more from failure, and I don't like using the word failure, but it's out there,
yep.
than we do from success, because
Yes.
we learn what we should not do anymore, or we
Right.
try something different, or whatever it is.
Yes. Totally, totally. So as we wrap up, is there one idea, thought that you would like to leave our listeners with today?
Well, I've probably said it at least 10 times, but no matter who you are or what you've been through, you have a story that matters. And so start finding those stories, start collecting those stories now, because you never know when you might need them, when someone else might need them.
Very true. So connect with Kelly on Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, Instagram, and her podcast, Epic Exchanges, where she interviews guests that shares their stories and of inspiration. So I'll put the links of all of those in the show notes, and also check out her latest book, Your Story, Your Strength, as well as the book, The Gift in Your Story, on Amazon and probably wherever you can buy your books. So thank you. Thank you so much again, Kelly, for being a guest on my podcast and helping us to realize that we all have gifts and strengths in our stories.